According to Pakistan historian Farzana Sheikh, it is then Pakistan's rivalry with India that has facilitated U.S. intervention in Pakistan, intervention largely encouraged by Pakistan's dominant military. In this transactional relationship of mutual dependence rather than mutual respect, the price for services rendered is all that has really mattered, and Pakistan has concluded that it has been dealt a raw deal by America. Pakistan has never come to terms with the fact that it has been able to use the United States only to a very limited extent vis-à-vis India, and today India's burgeoning relationship with the United States makes even that impossible. In July 2011, a string of high-level U.S. visitors to India and U.S. and Indian companies investing in each other's territory culminated when Secretary of State Clinton asked India to play a larger role in the region. India's leadership has the potential to positively shape the future of the Asia-Pacific, Clinton said in Chennai on July 20th. We think that America and India share a fundamentally similar vision for the future of this region. America's newfound love for India was loathsome to Pakistan, but Pakistan's military and political leaders never explained to the public that things had changed, that Pakistan could no longer have a relationship with the United States as a hedge against Indian power, and that Pakistan needed to repair its relations with India, which was steaming ahead of it in every field. In fact, the Bush administration had done several favors for Pakistan, apart from allowing the Taliban to take refuge in Pakistan. In 2006, Pakistan was caught red-handed, trying to smuggle the full components of a nuclear bomb-making plant to Libya, and the CIA and MI6 produced evidence that Pakistan had sold nuclear technology to Iran for cash, to North Korea in exchange for ballistic missile technology, and to other clients. Musharraf's military regime found itself in the world's proverbial doghouse. The military produced a convenient scapegoat in Pakistani scientist Dr. Abdul Qadir Khan, but he undoubtedly was not the only culprit, and the military itself was suspected of being involved. But Bush rode to the rescue and allowed Musharraf to blame Khan personally, accusing him of getting rich and selling nuclear secrets. Khan accepted all the blame for the proliferation on public TV and was sworn to secrecy for his own safety. The government then locked him up in a well-guarded house arrest for many years so that the truth could not emerge. Musharraf wanted a second-strike nuclear capability. The military wanted to place nukes on missiles because it lacked the high-technology planes necessary to deliver bombs. They wanted to produce more plutonium to build more bombs, and they wanted to add to their single Chinese-donated nuclear reactor at Kushab in Punjab by buying 2 more reactors. The military, which ran and protected the nuclear program, achieved all these aims over time because the Bush administration had no clear nuclear non-proliferation strategy, and even as it signed a nuclear agreement with India, it provided no incentive to either country to restrict the expansion of nuclear weapons programs. Bush was not as concerned about Pakistan's nuclear weapons as he was about maintaining close cooperation with the ISI in catching al-Qaeda. But fears about security inside Pakistan's nuclear facilities were constant. At least 70,000 people worked in Pakistan's nuclear industry, including security personnel. Any one of them could become susceptible to extremist propaganda. After 9/11, the United States gave Pakistan more than $100 million to secretly bolster the security and fail-safe mechanisms around its bombs. The Army, which controlled the nuclear program, did not want it disclosed that it was taking money from the Americans to make its bombs safe. Some exchange of safety technology between the United States and Pakistan also appears to have taken place. By 2010, Pakistan had more than 100 nuclear weapons, a second-strike capability, and miniature bombs that it could place on long-range mobile missiles. But the Army was still not satisfied that this was a sufficient deterrent against India, and wanted more. Nobody knows how much Pakistan actually spends on the nuclear program, because it is a state secret, and is presumably hidden in other budget lines like pensions and health. Meanwhile, Pakistan is the only country that opposes the proposed International Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, which would cap fissile material stockpiles, a key Obama foreign policy aim. Pakistan says India has access to fissile material through its civilian nuclear program, so Pakistan will have to keep producing and stockpiling fissile material until it is satisfied it has enough. As the Taliban attacks became more audacious and widespread in Pakistan, concerns arose about the safety of Pakistan's nuclear components. Bombs were always separated from their triggers and other components and stored separately. But what would happen if extremists were able to get inside information about one of these sites and raided it? The experts deemed two Taliban attacks very sensitive. The first was the daring attack in October 2009 on the Army's General Headquarters. The complex houses the Office of the Strategic Forces Command, the office that runs the nuclear program on a day-to-day basis. 10 extremist terrorists penetrated inside the base by wearing Army uniforms, having an Army jeep, and carrying forged Army IDs. They held more than 40 officers and guards hostage for 20 hours before commandos blasted their way in. Ultimately, 14 officers and civilians were killed. The second was the attack on the Mehran Naval Base in Karachi in May 2011. It took place only a few miles from the Masroor Air Base, where nukes are stored, and here it took 18 hours before soldiers were able to end the siege, even though there were only 4 to 6 attackers. Both attacks were deemed inside jobs, in which soldiers on the base had provided the terrorists with classified maps and information. However slowly, Dr. Khan and his relatives began to speak about what had really happened to him. In 2008, his Dutch wife, Hendrina Khan, gave an interview to Der Spiegel, directly criticizing Musharraf's remarks in his 2006 memoir, In the Line of Fire. Musharraf had written, "I can say with confidence that neither the Pakistan Army nor any of the past governments of Pakistan was ever involved or had any knowledge of AQ's proliferation activities." Hendrina claimed he was lying, as the Army had packed all the consignments that went abroad and organized the planes that carried them. Even more devastating was an interview that Khan gave himself, in which he claimed, "Logistics and security at our plant were in the hands of the Army, and they checked each and every item that came in or left. How then could I have sent things to any country without the Army's knowledge? I took sole blame for this whole episode, because the political leadership urgently asked me to do so. I feel stabbed in the back by the very people who benefited most from my work, i.e., the Army." Finally, in 2011, through an intermediary who is suspected to be his daughter, Khan made documents available to the Washington Post that show that he transferred more than $3 million in payments by North Korean officials to senior officers in the Pakistan Army. A letter from the North Korean military spelled out the details of the bribes. The Pakistani military believed that the United States was deliberately leaking this information to the media to discredit the Army. Even though the United States made a major concession, allowing the Pakistan Army to save face both at home and abroad by blaming Khan for proliferation, the Army continued to mistrust the Americans. The Army's obsessive focus on India then prevented it from adopting a counterinsurgency strategy when it came to fighting its own anti-state Pakistani Taliban. The U.S. military, and in particular Admiral Mullen, spent much of 2008 and 2009 trying to persuade General Kayani to allow the United States to retrain 2 divisions or even 2 brigades of Pakistan's regular forces to conduct counterinsurgency in Fatah. Kayani refused, telling Mullen repeatedly that any war would be fought on the plains of Punjab with India, rather than in the mountains of Waziristan. Furthermore, after Mumbai, India had adopted a new cold start strategy, to be able to deliver an attack against Pakistan within 72 hours, which precluded any major Pakistan Army deployment in Fatah and negated the value of counterinsurgency training. In other words, the Pakistan Army had no use for counterinsurgency. Kayani's views were short-sighted, especially as the Pakistani Taliban quickly developed an offensive capability. But President Asif Ali Zardari and Prime Minister Yusuf Raza Gilani refused to contradict Army Chief Kayani or initiate a debate about the issue in Parliament or the media. After months of cajoling, Kayani finally agreed to allow 70 American Special Forces officers to train Pakistanis in counterinsurgency, But for the time being, the recipients of the training would be not regular army, but Frontier Corps, FC. The FC was made up mainly of Pashtun tribesmen who were underarmed and undertrained, whose pay and morale were low, who had been plagued by desertions, and who had a deep reluctance to fight their fellow Pashtuns in the Taliban. The Americans obliged reluctantly, and began to pay for better equipment for the FC. The Army's lack of training in counterinsurgency had proved devastating whenever it had been deployed in Fatah. In August 2008, for example, the generals sent the Army to the Bajaur tribal agency in Fatah to rid it of Pakistani Taliban, promising a 2-week campaign. But 8 months later, the Army was still fighting. Counterinsurgency has a doctrine of clear, hold, and build that is aimed at protecting the people and their homes. In Bajaur, the Army's tactics were the direct opposite. It moved out the population, flattened villages with artillery, and used bombing and bulldozers to create vast free-fire zones. Without a local population to provide them with intelligence, information, or protection, the troops became sitting ducks for the rebels. Some 400,000 people fled Bajaur and became refugees, creating an enormous humanitarian crisis. But the Army refused to allow NGOs to come and help. Among those who fled were tribal elders and educated youth, all vehemently anti-Taliban, who, had they been protected, would have provided the necessary backup to military operations. Getting counterinsurgency right is about getting the strategic priorities right. For some years, the military still perceived India, and not the Taliban, as the greater threat. But as early as 2000, a classified report, commissioned by the Army, called Pakistan's Security Imperatives in the Medium Term, concluded that Pakistan's security threat was primarily internal and related to Islamic extremism, and that unless strategic thinking changed, a tiny, well-organized minority could drag the country in an undesirable direction. The Army continues to see terrorism merely as a latent threat, and India as the more clear and present danger, said Lieutenant General Mahmood Ali Durrani, the former National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Gilani. We have not grappled with the issue of extremism seriously, neither the public, nor the government, nor Army. In Fatah, Taliban militants appeared to learn more quickly than the Army. The Pashtun Taliban began to copy lessons from the LT's campaigns in Kashmir. Suicide bombing had never existed in South Asia before 1990, but when the Tamil rebels introduced it in Sri Lanka, the LT in Kashmir and other groups quickly followed the example. The LT called them Fedayeen attacks. Rather than committing suicide with a bomb-laden vest, militants would attack an Indian outpost with the intention of fighting to the death. After al-Qaeda retreated into Pakistan after 2001, it enlisted its own suicide bombers, mainly Pakistanis and Central Asians, to attack U.S. troops in Afghanistan, even though Islam strictly forbids suicide. The Haqqani network and Pakistan's Taliban commanders soon developed suicide bombing into a veritable industry, persuading or forcing gullible Pakistani and Afghan teenagers to become bombers and then selling them to commanders in the field. Manufacturing parts for suicide vests became a cottage industry in Fatah, with different families and villages producing the belts, ball bearings, and detonators, while the Taliban provided the explosives. Suicide attacks have now become a major tactic for both the Afghan and Pakistani Taliban. In 2010, a total of 87 suicide attacks in Pakistan killed more than 3,000 people. Washington little understood the Pakistan Army High Command's refusal to cooperate closely with the U.S. military, its rejection of counterinsurgency training, and its deep hatred for India. The United States promised joint actions and policies, then acted unilaterally. Acute disagreements among Holbrooke, the White House, and the Pentagon seriously hampered U.S. policy and allowed the Pakistanis to play off one against the other. Later, the CIA, the State Department, and Pakistan disputed the use of drones. As predicted, the Obama administration began with a tough line toward Pakistan, but developed no strategic plan to win over the military. On July 12, 2008, Admiral Mullen arrived in Islamabad to warn Kayani to eliminate the Haqqani network and Maulvi Nazir Nazir's Pakistani Taliban militia, which was attacking U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Mullen showed Kayani evidence that the ISI was working with both organizations. The military leadership nodded and did nothing. In December, after the Mumbai attack, General Michael Hayden, the CIA director, arrived, demanding that Pakistan close down the LT and dismantle its infrastructure. Pakistan refused. Pakistani generals seem oblivious to the fact that ending the Taliban insurgency in their country and helping stabilize Afghanistan should be a higher priority than countering an imagined Indian threat. They seem heedless of the fact that they need to end their policy of supporting certain Taliban while fighting others, and instead start de-radicalizing militant groups in Punjab, or that they need to end Haqqani's control over North Waziristan and push the Afghan Taliban into a dialogue with Kabul to end the war. They seem unaware that their present course is putting Pakistan's security in the hands of the Taliban, that the isolationist path is at odds with the Army's own strategic interests as well as those of Afghanistan, the entire region, and the West, and that it will ultimately endanger Pakistan's internal security and future development. Tragically, there is no political challenger at home who can say these things to the generals and mold a debate around what the Army's strategy should be. On the contrary, both Zardari and Gilani appear to be terrified of General Kayani, and instead of using civilian power such as the media and parliament to raise these issues, both men want to avoid riling the Army so they can have long and safe terms in office. Chapter 4. Afghanistan. The First Surge and the Failure of Elections. Afghanistan had been at war for 31 years. There had been only a brief interlude of peace between the winter of 2001 and 2, when the Taliban had been defeated, and the spring of 2003, when the Taliban restarted the insurgency. The enormous Afghan desire for security, peace, and economic development, which they expected of their American benefactors and occupiers, was not to be fulfilled. During the brief respite of 2002, Afghans voted with their feet. Some 3 million Afghan refugees in Iran and Pakistan rushed home, and thousands more arrived from richer climes in Europe and the United States, with money to invest and skills to serve their rickety new government. As I traveled across the country that year, I sensed enormous enthusiasm and expectation in the air. The Americans had promised so much. Surely they would deliver. The interim president, Hamid Karzai, seemed honest, amiable, and sufficiently modern, with no record of acting like a warlord, a rarity in Afghanistan. The Americans had unleashed the warlords to destroy the Taliban, but now they would control them. The alienated Pashtuns would be won over. Contrary to all stereotypes that Afghans were paranoid about foreigners in their land, goodwill toward the Americans and others was everywhere. Children and adults followed the foot patrols of the 5,000-strong International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, mainly British troops, around Kabul in awe. Everyone was exhausted from the fighting. Even my skeptical self, with 3 decades of waiting for an Afghan window of peace to open, only to see it shut a few months later and fighting erupt again, even I held my breath and believed that this time the window would stay open. Then President Bush went on to invade Iraq, and a fraction of those U.S. troops, resources, money, and global commitments could have turned Afghanistan toward peace and prosperity. Suddenly, all seemed lost once again. 7 years on, in the weeks before his inauguration as president in the winter of 2009, Barack Obama clearly had Afghanistan and Pakistan on his mind. He had made withdrawing U.S. forces from Afghanistan a campaign issue. But before he even occupied the White House, he had to face more ongoing crises than any other U.S. president in history. The collapse of Lehman Brothers, the American stock market crash, and the bankruptcy of major banks and investment houses, followed by the worst recession since the Great Depression, were his major preoccupations. Well before his inauguration, Bush had enlisted him to look for solutions to these crises and to the growing crisis in Afghanistan. A few days before the inauguration, and with little notice, I was invited to have dinner with the president-elect, along with a few other American foreign policy experts. I flew from Pakistan for my first meeting with an American president. He strode into the dining room with 3 senior aides, made some friendly remarks, and cracked jokes that instantly put everyone at ease. Unusually tall and thin, his body seemed to glide around the guests as he shook hands. His easygoing, informal manner appeared to be a major personal asset. He had just come from a long briefing by the Bush team on Afghanistan. I asked him whether Pakistan was discussed, and he replied that the crisis in Pakistan was discussed even more than Afghanistan. He said that until recently he had had no idea how bad the problems were in either country. Both countries would need an enormous amount of his attention, he now realized, far more than he had anticipated. During the campaign, Obama's team had been very critical of Bush for deferring so many key decisions in the region to his successor: funding for the Afghan war effort and economic development, increasing U.S. troop levels, speeding up building the Afghan army, and getting NATO to do more. For months, these decisions had been deferred. Bush would order policy reviews, and then not implement their conclusions. Obama was entering a policy quagmire to which too little thought, attention, and action had been paid. Much of the dinner discussion was taken up with what Obama could do internationally to revise the negative perceptions and ruinous unilateralism that had resulted from Bush's obsession with the war on terror. The Muslim world was acutely alienated, but also was hopeful and curious about a U.S. president whose parentage and upbringing straddled so many identities. He was black with a white mother and an African Muslim father, had lived in Indonesia, had traveled to Pakistan, India, and Kenya, and had Muslim relatives, a unique and engaging background. For years, many Americans believed he was a Muslim, which was not the case. I pointed out to him that many autocratic and dictatorial Muslim rulers were deeply apprehensive. They feared that Obama might be too radical, too demanding of them to reform their societies, and that their strategic alliances with the United States, partly because of oil, could be at risk. Pakistan's newly elected president, Asif Ali Zardari, and its powerful army chief, General Ashfaq Parvez Kayani, had mixed feelings about Obama. The Pakistan Army had always had an easier time with Republican administrations than with Democratic ones. After 9/11, it had built a cozy relationship with Bush, who had lavished billions of dollars of aid on Pakistan and had not asked too many difficult questions about the whereabouts of the Taliban or how the aid was being spent. 80% of the $11.8 billion funneled to Pakistan in aid between 2001 and 2008 had gone to the military, with an unprecedented lack of accounting by either Islamabad or Washington. The Pakistanis now feared it was coming to an end. Likewise, Afghanistan's Hamid Karzai had spent 8 years dealing on a daily basis with top Bush officials and had had monthly fireside video conversations with Bush himself. He, too, was nervous about the new man in the White House, who had already declared that the video conversations were over. Moreover, Americans who had criticized the Afghan and Pakistani leaders' policies would now hold senior positions in the new administration. In February 2008, Joseph Biden, the incoming vice president, had spoken harshly about Bush's policy failures in words that had deeply annoyed the Afghan and Pakistani leadership. 6 years after we've ousted the Taliban, Biden said, Afghanistan is a forgotten war, and that country, in my view, is slipping into failure, or toward failure. The Taliban is back. Al-Qaeda is regenerated along the border. Violence is up and drug production is booming, and the Afghan people have very little faith in the ability of their government to deliver a better future. Pakistani cooperation in the fight against extremism has been sporadic at best. The reason is that until recently, the terrorists we're fighting and the extremists the Pakistani fear are not one and the same. His words rang true to many people. Obama was not ignorant about the challenges of Afghanistan, but none of his Chicago-based advisers knew anything about the region. His campaign had set up a large group of American experts on Afghanistan and South Asia, experienced academics or retired officials. They prepared papers and discussed policy, but Obama never personally met with them and never took their advice. He had visited Afghanistan once, in July 2008, a trip that also took him to Iraq. His aides had determined that the trip had to be made in total secrecy, which was absurd. The experts were never consulted as to what he should say or do there. This trait was to become common in the early Obama presidency. On that trip, Obama made the mistake of first meeting with Governor Gul Agha Sherzai, a rival of Karzai's for influence in their common hometown of Kandahar. Sherzai was a corrupt and brutal warlord, a deeply unsavory character, and Karzai did not take kindly to their meeting in Jalalabad. When Obama met with Karzai, he reassured him that he would pay far more attention to Afghanistan than Bush had done, and that he would work on Pakistan to give up its Taliban sanctuaries. Karzai was far from convinced. During his campaign, Obama had described the Afghan war as a necessity, while Iraq was a war of choice and a mistaken one. The money that the United States had spent on the reconstruction of Afghanistan since 2001, Obama had said, was equivalent to 3 weeks' expenditure on military operations in Iraq. If he was elected, he would rectify that by increasing annual non-military aid from $1 billion to $3 billion. Initially, the U.S. military, already overstretched in Iraq, was nervous that Obama would put more demands on it. Admiral Mullen had famously said, "In Afghanistan we do what we can. In Iraq we do what we must. The Afghan war is, by design and necessity, an economy of force operation." Obama himself had a very low opinion of the merits of the Iraq war, while the Afghan war was clearly being lost. "The Iraq war," he said, "distracts us from every threat that we face and so many opportunities we could seize. This war diminishes our security, our standing in the world, our military, our economy, and the resources that we need to confront the challenges of the 21st century." As he left office, George W. Bush was warned by his military commanders that the security situation in Afghanistan was going from bad to worse. More troops were needed, and the Afghan presidential elections, scheduled for April 2009, would have to be postponed. Bush passed the buck to Obama. But changing the election date demanded early action. So Bush asked Karzai to find a constitutional way to postpone it until August. Even that was to prove to be too early, given the worsening security situation. Due to institutional inertia, Bush had rarely reevaluated U.S. strategic priorities in the region. His administration's ideological moorings saw the world in black and white. Iraq and al-Qaeda were the main threat. Afghanistan was an afterthought. Iran was an enemy, and Pakistan was an ally. Karzai kept raising with him the danger posed by the Taliban resurgence, but to no avail. Meanwhile, Pakistan saw Bush's inattention as a free pass to continue to support the Taliban while keeping pressure on al-Qaeda. Until 2004, the United States had only 15,000 troops based in Afghanistan, which has a population of over 30 million. In 2007, as the Taliban insurgency was spreading, there were still only 25,000 U.S. troops there. Frustrated U.S. officials in Afghanistan would tell me that Washington did no serious intelligence gathering on the Taliban threat until 2006. Neither the White House nor the Pentagon was interested in monitoring Quetta or the Baluchistan-Afghanistan border from which the Taliban infiltrated. "We didn't know enough. It took us almost 6 months to figure out what we were doing," Lieutenant General David M. Rodriguez admitted in 2007. "We fought hard every day to understand how Afghanistan worked, but we had a very shallow knowledge." In the summer of 2008, the Taliban launched a bloody offensive that, in June, killed more Western troops, 43, than in any month since 2001. The Taliban's use of improvised explosive devices, IEDs, increased by 200%. They undertook audacious attacks inside Kabul, and in Kandahar, a brilliantly planned jailbreak freed 1,100 Taliban prisoners. As a result of the deteriorating situation in the provinces, some 36 Afghan and Western aid workers were killed in 2008, and another 92 were kidnapped. 40% of the country was now off-limits to the UN and aid workers, while many Afghans and the international community held Karzai's government in low esteem for failing to tackle corruption or improve governance. But all this was temporarily forgotten on a cold day in Washington, January 20th, 2009, when Obama took office. That day, the Taliban mounted 3 attacks in eastern Afghanistan, including a double suicide bombing that killed 15 people. In the south, it was announced 650 schools were closed down because of Taliban attacks, cutting off 200,000 children from education. There were just not enough troops to guard everyone. The United States had 161,000 troops in Iraq, but only 32,000 in Afghanistan, along with 29,000 NATO troops. Even as Obama urged European governments to send more troops to Afghanistan, polls show that 3/4 of European voters rejected that idea. International patience with the war was waning fast. In 2008, the death toll for U.S. soldiers in Iraq was down by 1/3, but 151 died in Afghanistan, up from 111 in the previous year. The UN said that Afghan civilian deaths increased by 40% in 2008. Clearly, the military situation was deteriorating. The reviews of the situation in Afghanistan that Bush had ordered up were now awaiting Obama's attention. They had been produced by NATO, by the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon, by the U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, where General David Petraeus was now in charge, and by the White House. At CENTCOM, Petraeus had enlisted more than 100 experts from all parts of the U.S. government and academia to carry out the review. To cut through the confusion, Obama asked Bruce Riedel, a former CIA official and a long-term expert on the region who had led Obama's South Asia team before the election, to merge all the reviews and come to conclusions for short-term needs in Afghanistan. General David McKiernan, the commander in Afghanistan, had asked for 30,000 troops earlier in the year, a request to which Bush had not responded. Now McKiernan said he needed even more. McKiernan's desperation was driven by the need to secure the ground for the Afghan presidential election in August. An intense debate ensued between the Pentagon and the White House as to how many troops to send. On January 21, 2009, Obama appointed veteran diplomat and peacemaker Richard Holbrooke as his special envoy for both Afghanistan and Pakistan, which would now be called AFPAC. Holbrooke put together a large interagency team and brought in academic experts so he could deal comprehensively with everything from military issues to economic aid, boosting education and media spin. Realizing the importance the United States was giving Afghanistan, major Western countries followed suit, appointing their own special envoys. The debate on how many troops to send to Afghanistan, detailed in Bob Woodward's Obama's Wars, preoccupied the White House for months. Tragically, the near-exclusive focus on military engagement prevented greater discussion of important strategic issues: Afghanistan's economic, political, and social future, peace talks with the Taliban, and U.S. policy toward Pakistan. Holbrooke's office issued paper after paper on these larger issues, but they were rarely discussed. The highly perceptive British ambassador to Kabul, Sherard Cooper Coles, later wrote that, just plunging on with a strategy of pouring in more troops and more money, without doing something about governance and about the political offer to the Afghan people and something to engage the regional players, was a recipe for eventual failure. Finally, the White House and the Pentagon agreed that 17,000 soldiers and 4,000 trainers would be deployed as soon as possible. The first 8,000 soldiers, Marines, would go to Helmand province in the south, where the violence was worst. The south was the center for the insurgents, the main heroin production area, and the principal area of access to Pakistan and Taliban supply lines. 8,000 British troops that had been deployed there since 2006 were too thinly stretched out and had failed to establish peace. Helmand actually had only 1% of the total Afghan population. According to the new counterinsurgency strategy that Petraeus favored and that was being practiced in Iraq, U.S. forces should have been deployed in densely populated areas. But a year earlier, the U.S. Marines had decided they wanted to move their men from Iraq to southern Afghanistan, a decision that was little discussed in the Bush White House, and started building a massive base in the Helmand Desert. Now Obama had no option but to commit Marines to Helmand, even though it made little military or political sense. In some ways, all the decisions presented to Obama were either pre-cooked or pre-decided because of constraints or logistics. The Marine Corps and the Special Operations Forces, SOF, had parallel chains of command and did not come under the overall command of the U.S. military commander in Kabul, who led the joint U.S. and NATO forces in what was called the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF. This created considerable confusion, as Marines were allowed to decide where they would be based without first conferring with the overall military command. A year later, the Marine Corps was brought under ISAF command. On March 27, 2009, Obama announced his plan to send an additional 21,000 troops to Afghanistan. His goal was to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and to prevent their return to either country in the future. He doubled the number of civilian advisors and experts and increased funds for economic development and for building up the Afghan army and police, but refused to define it all as nation-building. He got tough on corruption within the Afghan government. For Pakistan, he had harsh words. He demanded that it do more to root out extremism, but imposed few sanctions, and dangled few carrots to enforce the threat. The following week at the NATO summit in Strasbourg, and then at the European Union summit in Prague, Obama asked Europe to come up with more troops. But the response was tepid. Britain agreed to send 2,000 more, and Poland another 400. But Obama was stuck with securing the Afghan presidential election in August. Everyone, the United States, NATO, the UN, and many Afghans, understood that because of the country's high level of violence, the election was a disaster waiting to happen, and that Karzai would ultimately rig it. Many believed that it should be postponed for a year or more, or until violence was reduced, the insurgency was under control, and governance in Kabul was improved. The White House never properly debated the issue. The entire first year of the 2009 Obama surge in manpower and money would have to be spent on securing the country for the election, rather than on developing a long-term counterinsurgency and economic development strategy. Richard Holbrooke would shake his head and tell me that the election was a huge distraction from what really needed to be done on the ground. Through the summer, U.S. military offensives, aid money, and development projects were all directed at getting the public out to vote rather than building long-term security. Karzai, who had become more controversial and unpredictable, insisted upon the election. In January 2008, at the World Economic Forum Summit in Davos, Switzerland, I had a long dinner with him, alone, at the chalet where he was staying. I urged him to delay the election, which he could have done through parliamentary approval, and to consider stepping down and seeing to an orderly political and generational transition. No Afghan ruler had achieved such a feat for a century, as most had been killed by their rivals. He should anoint someone younger whom he trusted to run as the next president, I said, and then he could retire as the honored father of the nation. He surprised me by saying he would think about it. We discussed several potential candidates, and the person he seemed to trust most was Hanif Atmar, then the education minister. In 2010, the increasingly paranoid Karzai would sack Atmar on unsubstantiated charges. Then, 3 months after Davos, Karzai told me in Kabul that he had to run for the good of the country, that the election could not be delayed, and that he needed his second term to secure peace with the Taliban. I suspected that his advisors and his brothers, who were then mired in alleged corruption scandals, were putting pressure on him to run again. The political careers and incomes of a large number of people depended on Karzai's remaining in power. Despite the compressed time given to organizing them, the 2004 presidential and 2005 parliamentary elections had been successful, with large voter turnouts, considerable public enthusiasm, and a wide choice of candidates. The Karzai team had done some heavy rigging and bribery in the South, but overall the political process had been advanced and helped legitimate the Constitution and the leadership. In 2004, Karzai won his first full term as president against 23 other candidates, winning 55.4% of the vote with a voter turnout of some 60%. He was still relatively popular, and despite the lack of Western aid for rebuilding the country, Afghans still saw him as the leader most likely to secure that aid in the future. The most important factor, the Taliban insurgency, was not strong enough to undermine the election. Even in 2004, Afghans and Western officials had debated whether the election should be delayed. But in 2009, when the country faced a full-blown insurgency and had a barely functioning administration, economy, and army, and could ill afford an election, such a debate never took place. The problem was that for the Americans, elections had become a litmus test determining everything else. A U.S. intervention in any third-world country now consisted of holding an early election so that the country could be dubbed a democracy, and then the United States could head for the exit. By contrast, the European philosophy, favored by the UN, was to first build governance and an economic infrastructure, nation-building, so that elections could be both meaningful and sustainable. Elections should come at the end of such a process, not at the beginning, and certainly not in the midst of an insurgency. The institutions that post-election democratic governance required were still non-existent in Afghanistan. In 2009, the country had no party system, scant respect for parliament, which carried out little legislation, and no public mobilization or electoral awareness campaigns, while the elected officials of the provincial councils, which should have been greatly empowered, had been ignored. Instead, the patronage alliances made by warlords and powerful candidates continued to dominate the political scene, as they had in 2004. But in 2009, for very different reasons, the Americans and Karzai wanted elections and argued that any further delay would signal weakness to the Taliban. In the run-up to the election, Karzai became deeply suspicious of Obama and believed he wanted to replace him as president. He was convinced that Holbrooke was inducing other leading Afghans to run against him. Acute mistrust and dislike of the Americans was widespread, which made it morally much easier for Karzai's supporters to rig the election. This time, 17 million voters had 40 candidates to choose from. The two best known were both disgruntled former cabinet ministers, the Tajik leader and former foreign minister Abdullah Abdullah, and the Pashtun former finance minister Ashraf Ghani Ahmadzai. Karzai feared that he might not win the election outright and would be forced to go into a second round, which he wanted to avoid at all costs. His paranoia, fed by his aides and his brothers, led to astonishing conspiracy theories about evil U.S. and British intentions to